Have you ever wondered about the people standing behind the great figures of history, the ones who shaped their dreams, strengthened their courage, and filled their souls with a light that changed the world? When we hear the name Martin Luther King Jr., the echoes of freedom, the call for equality, and the famous "I Have a Dream" speech immediately come to mind. But where did that dream come from? Who planted the first spark in his heart? Behind him stood another great man, a father, a leader, a preacher, Martin Luther King Sr., affectionately known as Daddy King. This is the story of a boy born in a small town in Georgia, surrounded by poverty, deprivation, and the harsh shadows of segregation. He had no wealth, no power, no strong support, but he had faith, he had courage, and he had a determination to rise above his circumstances. This little boy, who would walk miles to a broken-down school with old books and too few teachers, grew into a man whose character inspired not only his children, but also a whole generation. On December 19, 1899, in Stockbridge, Georgia, a child named Michael King was born. This child's journey would one day change not only his own destiny, but through his son, alter the course of history itself. His parents were sharecroppers, laboring endlessly in the fields of others, trapped in cycles of poverty they could never escape. Michael's childhood was shaped by hardship and hunger. His mother, Delia Lindsay, was a deeply religious woman who endured every trial with prayers and hymns. She taught her son that human dignity did not come from the opinions of others, but from the hand of God himself. That lesson became his anchor for life. But life was never easy. Michael lost his mother at a young age, leaving a scar that remained with him always. That grief, however, gave birth to an unshakable resolve. He would not waste his life. He worked the fields, picked cotton, and supported his father, but a fire burned in his heart. He knew that if he was ever to escape poverty, if he was ever to change his condition, education was the only way forward. So he walked long miles to school, determined to learn, no matter how poor the resources. Slowly, he came to believe that he could write his own destiny. As the years passed, another calling began to stir within him. The church spoke to his soul. He realized that the pulpit was not only a place of worship, but a place of leadership, a platform where words became weapons and voices gave hope. He longed to be a man whose words could lift a whole community. This dream took him to Morehouse College in Atlanta, where young Black men were trained to become leaders. There, he found not just education, but inspiration. Surrounded by new ideas, he began to see himself in a new light. It was during this period that he chose to change his name. Inspired by the German reformer Martin Luther, he became Martin Luther King. Later, when his son bore the same name, he would be known as Martin Luther King Sr. This was more than a change of identity. It was a declaration that he belonged to a tradition of reformers who challenged injustice in the name of faith and truth. Life also brought him love. In 1926, he married Alberta Christine Williams, daughter of Reverend Adam Daniel Williams, the pastor of Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta. This marriage was not just a union of two people, but a turning point in destiny. Alberta was educated, graceful, and deeply faithful, a perfect partner for Martin's energy and ambition. Together, they built a home of love, discipline, and faith. They would have 3 children, Willie Christine, Martin Luther King Jr., and Alfred Daniel Williams King. At home, Daddy King was a strict yet loving father. He demanded excellence, emphasized education, and constantly reminded his children that no matter what society said, they were never less than anyone else. In 1931, after the death of his father-in-law, Martin Luther King Sr. became pastor of Ebenezer Baptist Church. This marked a defining moment in his life. He transformed the church into more than a place of worship. It became a center of community life, where faith, education, and the fight for justice intertwined. His voice carried both fire and hope. He was a preacher, a counselor, and a builder. Even before his son became a national figure, Daddy King was already known for his activism and courage. He openly challenged segregation and injustice, demanded the right to vote at a time when many were kept away by threats and intimidation, and stood firmly against police brutality. One memorable incident tells much about his character. When a police officer spoke to him disrespectfully, Martin Luther King Sr. looked him in the eye and said, "You are talking to a man." Those words were not just a reply, they were a philosophy. He refused to accept humiliation for himself, his family, or his people. Through this spirit of dignity and defiance, he taught his children that they must live with their heads held high, never bowing to injustice. These lessons became the foundation of his son's character. Martin Luther King Jr. would carry them into his own life, standing before the world with the same conviction, showing that dreams are not just imagined, they can be lived. As the years moved forward, Martin Luther King Sr. grew into more than a preacher and a father. He became a pillar in his community, like a man whose influence reached far beyond the walls of Ebenezer Baptist Church. Atlanta was a city changing slowly, painfully, under the weight of segregation and racial injustice, and Daddy King was determined to be a voice that could not be ignored. He believed that faith was not something to be locked away inside a church. It had to be lived out in the streets, in the schools, in the political battles of the day. His sermons thundered with conviction, calling his congregation not only to believe in God, but to stand up against the system that tried to crush their dignity. By the 1940s and 1950s, his son Martin Luther King Jr. was beginning to step into his own destiny. Daddy King was proud, but he was also watchful. He had raised his children to believe that they were as good as anyone else. And now he watched as his son carried that lesson onto the national stage. When Martin Jr. became pastor alongside his father at Ebenezer, it was not just a father and son sharing a pulpit. It was a continuation of a tradition, a passing of the torch, though Daddy King never truly stepped aside. He remained a guiding force, reminding his son to lean on faith when the world's burdens grew heavy. When the Montgomery bus boycott erupted in 1955, led by a young Martin Luther King Jr., Daddy King watched with pride and concern. He knew the risks. He had himself faced threats for speaking out against segregation. Now his son was in the spotlight, challenging the very foundations of Jim Crow. Daddy King became his steady support, praying with him, advising him, and standing by him in the face of bombings, arrests, and threats. He was not always in the headlines, but behind the scenes, his presence was constant. He was a father whose faith gave strength to his son in the most dangerous of times. But Daddy King was not merely a background figure in the civil rights movement. He took his own stand, marching, speaking, and refusing to remain silent. He fought for better schools in Atlanta, demanded equal opportunities for Black citizens, and used his influence as pastor to push for social change. He was respected by Black and white leaders alike, though often feared by those who clung to segregation. His voice carried authority because it came not from ambition, but from a lifetime of faith and struggle. Then came the moment no father should have to endure. On April 4th, 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee. The news shook the nation to its core, but for Daddy King, it was the shattering of his heart. The son he had raised, the boy he had taught to walk tall, was gone. Yet even in his grief, Daddy King did not collapse. He stood before the world at his son's funeral, leading the service with dignity and courage. People marveled at his strength, but that strength had been forged through years of faith and trials. In that moment, he showed once again the depth of his character. Tragedy did not end there. In 1974, another devastating blow struck when his wife, Alberta, was murdered inside Ebenezer Baptist Church itself. She had been playing the organ during a Sunday service when a disturbed young man opened fire. For Daddy King, it was almost unbearable. To lose his son and then his wife both to violence, It was a weight few could carry. And yet he did. He held on to faith even when tested beyond what most men could endure. He said that hatred had already taken too much from him, and he would not allow it to take away his spirit. Despite the pain, Daddy King continued to preach, to lead, and to inspire. He remained pastor at Ebenezer until 1975, guiding the church for more than 4 decades. His sermons were filled with wisdom born from suffering, but also with hope. He reminded his people that despair was never the final word. Even after retiring, he remained active in the community, speaking at events, supporting civil rights causes, and sharing the lessons of his life. In his later years, he looked back not with bitterness, but with gratitude. He had seen hardship, poverty, racism, and loss, yet he had also seen change. He had watched as barriers began to fall, as opportunities slowly opened for African Americans. He had lived to see his son's dream echo across the world, even after his death. And he had played his part, not only as a father, but as a leader in his own right. On November 11th, 1984, Martin Luther King Sr. passed away at the age of 84. His death marked the end of an era, but his legacy lives on, not only through his son's memory, but through the countless lives he touched directly. Daddy King was a man who rose from the cotton fields of Georgia to the pulpit of one of the most influential churches in America. He was a man who refused to bow to injustice, who taught his children to stand tall, and who carried himself with dignity, even in the face of unbearable tragedy. His story is a reminder that behind every great leader, there is often another leader who shaped them, guided them, and planted in them the seeds of greatness. Martin Luther King Jr. His dream was carried on the shoulders of a father who dreamed first, not only for himself, but for his children, his community, and his people. The name Martin Luther King does not belong to just one man, but to a legacy of faith, courage, and unshakable hope that began